On the evening of the 5th of September, 1887, approximately 300 people climbed a narrow staircase in the city of Exeter, Devon, and took their seats in the gallery of a brand new theatre. It was opening night. A popular melodrama was playing. The house was about half full, a comfortable crowd, not a crush, and the audience in the cheaper seats. Up in the gods were in good spirits, settled in for the fourth act. 186 of them did not walk out. There was no structural collapse, no gas explosion, no act of God, no sudden catastrophe that could not have been foreseen. What began the fire was as small as any industrial accident can be: a gauze curtain, a gas jet, and a handful of seconds. What turned that small fire into the deadliest theatre disaster in British history was not the flame itself. It was a single staircase. One staircase, turning twice in the dark, with a ticket collection box set directly in the doorway at the top, and not a single alternative route to the street below. The theatre had been standing for less than 11 months when it burned. It had been designed by one of the most prominent theatre architects in the country. And the magistrates who had licensed it to receive the public had been told, in writing, before it ever sold a ticket, that it required a safety curtain and a second means of escape from the gallery before it should open its doors. They issued the license anyway. 186 people died because of what happened in that building on that evening. 39 children were left without a single parent. A relief fund raised in the aftermath was still paying out to surviving dependents 44 years later, in 1931. A stone cross stands today over a mass grave in Higher Cemetery, Exeter, where 118 of the dead lie together in 15 shared coffins because they could not be individually identified. Before every performance, at every theatre in Britain, a heavy curtain is lowered to the stage. You have probably seen it and not given it a second thought. It is called a safety curtain. Its presence in every venue in this country, its legal requirement, its physical existence, traces directly to Exeter, September 1887, and to an inspection requirement that was written down, agreed upon, and then simply ignored. To understand why 186 people died in a building that was less than a year old, you have to go back to the beginning. Before this channel goes any further, if forgotten disasters from Victorian Britain are the kind of history you find yourself drawn to, please take a moment to subscribe. And a like helps more people find these stories. Most importantly, leave a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching from. It's one of the things I enjoy most about making this. Exeter, in the autumn of 1887, was a prosperous, self-assured city. It was not an industrial town. There were no collieries beneath its streets, no textile mills along its riverbanks, no foundries filling its air with soot. Exeter was a city of institutions. It was the seat of a Church of England diocese, governed from a great Norman cathedral that had stood in the heart of the city for 7 centuries. It was a county capital, home to the assizes and the county court and the offices of civic administration. It had a garrison. Soldiers of the Royal Horse Artillery were stationed there, a detail that would matter before the week was out. The population numbered somewhere between 40,000 and 50,000 souls, a figure that gave it the scale of a significant regional centre without the industrial density of a Manchester or a Birmingham. The city's character was civic and respectable. Its professional classes, solicitors, clergy, physicians, merchants, lived in the terraced streets and villas that ringed the ancient cathedral close. Its working families occupied the closer set housing to the north and east of the city centre. Monday evenings, for those who could afford the gallery seats, meant the theatre. The Theatre Royal on Longbrook Street was Exeter's principal house for live entertainment. It received the major touring companies that moved around Britain's provincial circuit, companies bringing productions fresh from the London stage, or productions built for the road, carrying popular melodramas and comic operas from city to city through the season. To attend the Theatre Royal was to participate in one of the central cultural institutions of Victorian civic life. The gallery, where the cheapest tickets were sold, was the democratic floor of that institution. Working families, young tradespeople, domestic servants on an evening off, children taken as a treat. The building that received those audiences on the 5th of September 1887 was not old. That is essential to understand. The Theatre Royal that burned was not a crumbling Regency relic held together with repairs and optimism. It was a new building. It had received its first paying audience on the 13th of October 1886, less than 11 months before the fire. The foundation stone had been laid on the 12th of May of that same year by the Mayor, Alderman R.M. Dorr, with all the civic ceremony appropriate to the occasion. Exeter was getting a new theatre, and it was getting one designed by a man of serious reputation. C.J. Phipps was, by 1886, among the most prolific and celebrated theatre architects working in Britain. His portfolio included the Savoy Theatre in London, the Garrick, the refurbished Haymarket, and a long list of provincial houses across England. He was not an obscure practitioner taking on whatever work came his way. He was a specialist, a craftsman of theatrical space, a man who understood the acoustics and sightlines and circulation requirements of a public entertainment building as well as anyone in the country. The Theatre Royal, Exeter, was one of his commissions, and he designed it in the Italian Renaissance style that suited the ambitions of the city's civic class. The builder was Seth Bevan of Plymouth. Interior joinery came from Jackson's of London, decorative mouldings from G. Steer of Salcombe. The theatre was owned by the Exeter Theatre Calamity and operated under lease by a manager named Sidney Herbert Bassing. The building had a licensed capacity of approximately 1,600. It occupied a prominent site at the junction of Longbrook Street and New North Road. Immediately adjacent to it, on Longbrook Street, stood the New London Inn, kept by a man named Robert Popel. That adjacency, a theatre and a public house, side by side in the autumn of 1887, is a small geographical fact, but it is one of the most consequential pieces of geography in this story. Now, to understand what the Theatre Royal was lit by, because this too will matter enormously before the night is over, you have to picture the interior in the way an 1887 theatre-goer would have experienced it. The house was lit by gas. Gas jets lined the stage and the auditorium, casting the particular warm, slightly wavering light that Victorian audiences associated with the pleasure of an evening out. The gas supply for the stage and the gas supply for the house. The seats, the circle, the gallery were connected. This was not unusual for the era. What it meant in practice was that if the stage gas was shut off in an emergency, the lighting throughout the entire building was extinguished simultaneously. Every lamp, every jet, the whole house plunged into complete darkness. That design choice had been accepted without question. Nobody on the licensing committee raised it as a concern. Nobody on the inspection team flagged it as a defect. It sat quietly in the fabric of the building, waiting. The performance scheduled for the night of the 5th of September was a melodrama called The Romany Rye, a production associated with the actor-manager Wilson Barrett and written by the popular playwright George Robert Sims. It was being toured by a company under the management of Gilbert Elliot, and the Theatre Royal date was the opening night of its Exeter run. Opening nights drew audiences with a particular kind of anticipation. The touring circuit had a reliable social rhythm, regular patrons knew when a new production was coming in, and the gallery was where the most enthusiastic, least inhibited section of the crowd sat. Approximately 300 people took seats in the gallery that evening. The stalls and dress circle held perhaps 400 to 500 more, making total attendance somewhere in the region of 700 to 800, roughly half the building's licensed capacity. This is a detail that cannot be passed over without emphasis. The theatre was not packed. It was not an unusually crowded night. The gallery held perhaps 300 people on a standard working evening in early September. The exits available to the people in the stalls and dress circle were wide, short and direct. The exit available to the 300 people in the gallery was a single staircase with multiple right-angled turns. It was always a single staircase. It was a single staircase at full capacity, and it was a single staircase on a half-empty Monday night. Among those 300 were working families who had saved for the evening. Among them were at least 14 people, aged 16 or younger. Among them was a man named Henry Davey, who had brought his 9-month-old son, Willie, to the theatre. That is enough to say about Willie Davey. His presence there is a fact. What it tells us is the kind of night it was. An ordinary family evening, a treat, a social pleasure, available even to those who had very little, because the gallery seats were cheap. The touring world of Victorian theatre was a commercial machine of considerable scale. Productions moved from city to city on tight schedules, loading sets and costumes onto railway wagons and reassembling them in each new house. The fly tower of a theatre, the tall void above the stage used to store and manoeuvre scenery, was the engine of that machine. On the night of the 5th of September, the fly tower of the Theatre Royal was loaded with 18 complete scene sets for the Romany Rye, plus a substantial stock of scenery already loaded in for the upcoming pantomime season. Painted canvas, wooden framing, ropes, pulleys, dry combustible material, stacked in a tall enclosed space directly above the gaslit stage. That is the theatre as it stood on the evening of opening night. A new building, less than 11 months old, a distinguished architect's design, a half-full house, 300 people in the gallery, one staircase between them and the street, and a fly tower crammed with scenery, above a stage lit entirely by gas. There is one more thing to understand before the night begins, a thing that happened before the theatre ever opened its doors, a thing that should have prevented everything that followed, and did not. Before the Theatre Royal could legally open to the paying public, it was required to pass a formal licensing inspection. This was the process by which the licensing magistrates of Exeter satisfied themselves that a place of public entertainment was fit and safe for the people who would fill it. The inspection took place. The inspectors walked the building, and they produced a list of requirements, specific, documented, written conditions that had to be met before the license was issued. 2 of those conditions stand out above all others. The first, the theatre was required to install a safety curtain, an iron or fire-resistant screen between the stage and the auditorium, capable of being dropped to seal off a stage fire from the public seating area. Without a safety curtain, a fire on the stage had a direct, unobstructed path into the house. The second, the gallery was required to have an additional means of escape. It had one staircase. The inspection identified this as insufficient. A second route out, a second staircase, an alternative exit, was specified as a condition of the licence. When the licensing magistrates of Exeter convened to consider the application, neither condition had been met. There was no safety curtain. There was no second exit from the gallery. The conditions were known. The gap was documented. The magistrates issued the licence regardless. The Theatre Royal opened on the 13th of October 1886. 300 people could now climb to the gallery through the single staircase entrance and return by the same single staircase, every night, with no alternative route and no fireproof barrier between them and the stage. For 11 months, this was the arrangement. 11 months of performances, 11 months of audiences in the gallery, 11 months without incident, which is how such things come to feel normal and how the absence of catastrophe becomes mistaken for the presence of safety. Wilson Barrett's melodrama was approaching its 4th act. The evening was going well. Now let us go further back to place this specific failure inside a broader picture. Because the licensing magistrates of Exeter did not grant their reckless permission in a complete vacuum. They did it inside a regulatory environment that made such decisions easier to make and harder to punish when they went wrong. In 1887, there was no national statutory code that governed the fire safety requirements for places of public entertainment with the force of law behind it. There had been a parliamentary bill on the subject, introduced in 1885, that would have imposed binding national standards on theatre construction and licensing. It had never been passed. Theatre licensing remained the responsibility of local magistrates in each jurisdiction, who relied on informal inspections, local custom, and their own judgment about what standards to require and enforce. There was no national inspection regime. There was no national code. There was no penalty beyond the theoretical withholding of a license for a magistrate who granted permission for a building that did not meet the conditions he himself had set. In the absence of legislation, fire insurance companies had begun moving into this space commercially. They imposed their own inspection regimes on theatre buildings, assessing structural risk and pricing their premiums accordingly. This was market pressure rather than law. A venue that failed an insurance inspection paid more for cover or struggled to get cover at all. It was a form of private regulation, imperfect and inconsistent, that had grown up precisely because the public regulatory framework had not kept pace with the rapid expansion of Victorian commercial entertainment. What Exeter represented in September 1887 was the purest possible expression of what that gap in the law produced: a brand new building, inspected, conditions set, conditions not met, license issued. The magistrates had the power to withhold the license until the safety curtain was installed and the second gallery exit was built. They did not use it, and there was no higher authority to compel them. In the Theatre Royal on Longbrook Street, Exeter, the fly tower was loaded with 18 sets of scenery and a pantomime stock. The gallery had one exit. The safety curtain was absent. The stage lighting and the house lighting ran on the same gas supply. Every page of Shaw's 1876 analysis might have been written specifically about this building. It was now the evening of Monday, the 5th of September, 1887. The audience had been in their seats for several hours. The Romany Rye was a busy production, melodrama of the popular sort, full of incident and scene changes. The Fly Tower had been active throughout the performance, moving the elaborate sets that Wilson Barrett's touring company carried. 4 acts, 18 scene sets, a full gantry operation, worked by a crew of stagehands in the dark above the stage. One of those stagehands was a man known only by his surname, Taylor. Taylor was operating the gantry when the 4th act drew toward its conclusion. The scenery for the closing scene needed to be moved. A gauze curtain, translucent, lightweight, the kind used to create atmospheric stage effects, was to be lowered from above. Taylor worked the mechanism. The gauze descended through the space above the stage, passing close to the gas jets that illuminated the performance below. It caught. The gauze was alight in seconds. Taylor saw it happen, and Taylor made a decision that was, in the circumstances, reasonable. He lowered a painted canvas drop scene to screen the fire from the audience, to buy time and prevent panic. The drop scene hung between the stage and the auditorium. The visible fire was, for a moment, concealed. Stage crew and cast, aware of the fire above them, moved toward the backstage exits. They opened the doors. The draft that came through those open doors found the drop scene. The drop scene, now exposed to a current of air and to heat from the burning gauze above it, caught and burned. The screen that had briefly contained the fire became part of it. And now the Fly Tower, 18 sets of painted canvas and wooden framing, packed together in a tall enclosed column directly above the stage, acting as a chimney, was fully engaged. The fire had an unobstructed path into the auditorium. There was no safety curtain to stop it. At this moment, the exact moment the stage fire became uncontainable, someone cut the stage gas supply. It was the correct instinct: shut down the fuel. But in this theatre, With this gas arrangement, cutting the stage supply extinguished every light in the building. The stalls, the dress circle, the gallery, the staircases, the corridors, every gas jet in the Theatre Royal went dark simultaneously. 300 people in the gallery were now in a burning building, in complete darkness, with one staircase between them and the street. The people in the stalls and dress circle moved toward their exits in what contemporary accounts describe as a perfectly cool manner, without panic. Their exits were wide, their routes were short. The stalls opened directly to street level. Most of the lower-tier audience was outside within minutes. The gallery was a different world. The gallery staircase descended from the upper tier through a series of right-angled turns. It was narrow, it was now dark, and the smoke that the low-ceilinged auditorium had been filling with, concentrated by a ceiling that Shaw's later report would identify as 5 feet too low for adequate circulation in a building with no smoke outlets over the stage or auditorium, was filling the staircase from above. At the head of the stairs, in the doorway that opened from the gallery into the staircase, the checkbox stood. The checkbox was a wooden structure used by the ticket attendant to collect stubs from audience members as they entered the gallery. It sat in the doorway. In the darkness, with people pressing forward behind them, those at the front of the crowd encountered the box before they could get onto the staircase. An unnamed survivor described what happened next, in testimony repeated in contemporary newspaper accounts. All the doors were open, but the checkbox was left in the doorway at the head of the stairs. I kicked the box aside. That survivor got through. Many others did not get that chance. The box, displaced or knocked, may have fallen across the doorway. The pressure of bodies behind those who had stopped at the obstruction, in the darkness, in the smoke, became its own force. At the same moment, on the exterior of the building, at least one of the outward-facing doors was bolted from outside. People attempting to escape through that door found it immovable. The fire brigade was called. The West of England. Insurance company's brigade, the Little West Engine, arrived approximately 5 minutes after the alarm. Other brigades followed. They brought water and they attacked the fire on the lower levels. But the people in the gallery needed something the fire brigade had not yet brought to Longbrook Street. A wheeled ladder, capable of reaching the upper windows, where men, women and children were now visible at the sills. The wheeled ladder was stored at the Guildhall. It was chained. The key holder could not be found. It took approximately 20 minutes to locate someone who could release the chain. 20 minutes during which the only access to the upper windows of a burning theatre was whatever could be improvised from the street. And that is where Robert Popel comes into this story. Robert Popel was the landlord of the New London Inn, which stood directly beside the Theatre Royal on Longbrook Street. He was on the scene before the fire brigade reached its full strength, before the wheeled ladder had been located, before any coordinated rescue operation had been assembled. Popel did what a man of practical resource does when there is no system yet in place to help. He went and found ladders. He gathered 5 or 6 of them, from where exactly depends on the account, but quickly, and within minutes of the alarm. He brought them to the side of the burning theatre and set them against the walls. Through those improvised ladders, approximately 50 to 60 people were brought down from the upper windows and the exterior of the building, rescued from a structure that was filling with smoke and beginning to lose its internal integrity. Popel also opened the doors of the New London Inn, making the pub's interior a shelter and triage point for survivors, and he made his stable yard available as the initial place where, as the fire progressed and the staircase was reached, the dead were laid. Popel was not alone. Along the exterior wall of the theatre, a young able seaman named William Hunt from HMS Express climbed the decorative exterior pillars of the Theatre Royal's facade, hauled himself up the stonework, hand over hand, to reach people visible at the upper windows and pull them to safety. He made the climb multiple times. He received the Royal Humane Society Bronze Medal for what he did that night, and was subsequently promoted to leading seaman. A driver named George Cooper pulled several people to safety through a broken window. A civilian named Jimmy Lewin received a Royal Humane Society certificate for passing both the living and the dead through a window in the building's upper story. And there was a bombardier of the Royal Horse Artillery named Frank Scattergood. Scattergood was a soldier of the garrison, the kind of man who runs toward a fire rather than away from it as a matter of trained instinct. He made multiple rescues that night, entering the vicinity of the burning building when others could not, carrying at least one child out of the stage area to safety. He was overcome by smoke. He sustained severe burns. He was taken to hospital. The fire was not yet fully extinguished when Scattergood's condition became grave, and in the days that followed, he died of his injuries. He was the only confirmed rescuer to die in the attempt. His comrades in the Royal Horse Artillery later erected a separate memorial headstone in his honour at Higham Cemetery, Exeter, adjacent to the main monument for the dead. The fire itself burned with a ferocity that reflected everything that had been loaded into that fly tower. The painted canvas sets for the Romany Rye, the pantomime scenery, the wooden framing and the ropes, the Theatre Royal was substantially destroyed within approximately 1 hour of ignition. It was visible and audible across central Exeter. By the time the fire had been controlled, the interior was a ruin. The Topsham Fire Brigade, who responded to the call and worked through the night, were later singled out by name for commendation from the Home Secretary. When the staircase from the gallery could finally be reached, when the fire had been suppressed enough for rescuers to enter the building, Harry Foote was among the first men to go in. What he found on that staircase became the single most important piece of ground-level testimony about what had happened to the people of the gallery. Foote described what he saw in testimony, quoted in the newspaper accounts of the days that followed. On the first flight of the staircase, he found hats, coats, caps, jackets, and other items of clothing. No people. On the second flight, the upper section, the one approaching the ticket keeper's office, he found bodies. The smoke, he noted, had filled the upper staircase from the auditorium. He observed precisely and clinically that this smoke had suffocated those whom I saw lying dead in the second flight, because there was no sign of any crush there. Read that carefully. On the upper flights, people had been overcome before the crowd pressure reached them. They had not been trampled. They had been caught by the smoke before they could move. Lower down the staircase, it was different. There the bodies lay piled higher than the handrails on both sides. Those who had fallen at the bottleneck, at the checkbox, in the dark, on the narrow turn, had brought others down, behind, and on top of them. Both things were happening in the same staircase, at the same moment. Asphyxiation at the top, crushing below. 186 people died that night, and in the days immediately following. 68 of the dead could be identified. Their bodies were recognizable enough, their families near enough, for individual identification and individual burial. 118 could not be identified at all. They were interred in 15 shared coffins in a mass grave at Higham Cemetery. Among the dead was Willie Davey, aged 9 months, who had been at the theatre with his father Henry. Both of them were gone. Lucy Coombs, the wife of the checkbox attendant, had been caught in the crush at the exit. She should have known better than anyone. She died. 39 children were fully orphaned. 98 more lost at least one parent. A relief fund was established almost immediately. The response was extraordinary in its breadth. Queen Victoria contributed £100. The actor-manager Henry Irving, whose name will return in this story, gave £100. The Lord Mayor of London contributed £1,537, the single largest individual donation. Money came from Paris, from Australia, from America, from the goldfields of South Africa. The fund ultimately raised £20,763, a substantial sum for 1887 and a measure of the shock that the disaster sent through the English-speaking world. Over 10,000 people attended the funeral at Higher Cemetery. The stone cross that Harry Hems carved over the mass grave still stands. Now the question that Exeter and the country demanded an answer to was not simply what had happened, but why and who was responsible. The coroner's inquest opened on the 21st of September 1887, 16 days after the fire. It would run for several sessions before the jury returned a verdict, and simultaneously the government moved to commission a parallel investigation of a more authoritative kind, a formal parliamentary inquiry entrusted to the man who knew more about theatre fires than anyone else in Britain. Captain Sir Eyre Massey Shaw had been Chief Officer of the Metropolitan Fire Brigade since 1861. He had published his analysis of theatre fire hazards in 1876. He had, in the years since, watched a catalogue of continental theatre disasters and continued to press the case for mandatory safety standards in British places of public entertainment. Shaw knew what killed people in theatre fires. He had known it for more than a decade. The government asked Shaw to investigate the Theatre Royal fire with a jury of 21. His report was submitted on the 29th of September 1887, a matter of weeks after the disaster. In it, he identified 12 separate serious design and construction defects in the building. 12. In a theatre that had been open for less than 11 months, designed by one of the country's most celebrated practitioners. Let us go through the ones that mattered most, because the accumulation of them is the accountability case. The gallery had a single exit staircase with multiple right-angled turns. No alternative, no secondary route. 300 people, one way down. There were no smoke outlets over the stage or the auditorium. The smoke that the burning fly tower produced had nowhere to go but into the house and down into the seating areas and through the staircase. The ceiling of the auditorium was 5 feet lower than it should have been. 5 feet of headroom lost, which meant the smoke descended to the level of standing figures far sooner than it would have in a correctly proportioned space. The gas supply for the stage and the house were connected, so that cutting one extinguished both. The moment the crew acted to shut down the stage fire's fuel supply, every light in the building was extinguished. The materials used in parts of the construction, lath, plaster, matchboarding, were flammable in areas where fire-resistant materials were required. There was no safety curtain. The inspection had required one. It was not there. The checkbox was positioned directly in the doorway at the head of the gallery staircase, an obstruction in the only escape route from the building's most vulnerable tier. At least one exterior door was bolted from the outside. The hose provision was inadequate, another condition of the licensing inspection not met. There was no secondary means of escape from the gallery, a point that had been specifically required by the inspection and specifically unmet at the time the license was issued. Shaw's report addressed Phipps's attempt to answer this requirement. The architect had argued, in submissions to the licensing process, that dropping over the edge of the balcony constituted an adequate second means of escape from the gallery. Shaw's inquiry rejected this entirely. It was not an escape route, it was a fall. The roof over the gallery was too low, further compressing the smoke that accumulated in the upper tier. 12 defects, in a building that was 11 months old. Shaw's summary was unequivocal. His assessment of the Theatre Royal Exeter was that there could be very few worse theatres in the country. Not older ones, not poorly maintained ones, not a theatre that had been patched and repaired over decades of compromise. This one, this new purpose-built, architect-designed building on Longbrook Street, which had cost the Exeter Theatre Company a significant sum to construct and which bore the name of one of the most prominent practitioners in the country. The responsibility, Shaw found, fell primarily on two parties, C.J. Phipps and the licensing magistrates of Exeter. Phipps had designed the building with the defects that Shaw catalogued. At the inquiry, the architect offered a defence that must be noted carefully, because it is exactly the kind of argument that institutions and professionals reach for when catastrophe arrives and the question becomes who is responsible. Phipps stated that a number of changes had been made during construction from the designs he had originally proposed. The deviations from his plans, he implied, were not his doing. The builder, the operator, someone else in the chain between drawing and construction had altered what he intended. The inquiry did not accept this as exculpation. Phipps was the architect of record. The defects in the building were structural and design defects. The absence of a safety curtain was not a deviation from Phipps's plans, it was a feature of the original design. The single gallery exit was in the original design. The low ceiling was in the original design. The connected gas supply was in the original design. Whatever changes had been made in construction, the foundational failures were in the architecture, and the architecture was Phipps's. The licensing magistrates bore the second share of blame, and in some ways the more damning one, because the magistrates had not been deceived about the building's deficiencies. They had been told. The inspection had produced a list of requirements. Those requirements included the safety curtain and the secondary gallery exit. The magistrates knew when they convened to consider the licence application that neither had been provided, and they issued the licence. The inquest jury's verdict was accidental death, the formal classification. But the jury's accompanying censure was pointed and specific. The magistrates were criticised explicitly for granting the licence when the conditions of their own inspection had not been met. Phipps was censured for the design defects and for his misrepresentation of the balcony drop as an adequate escape route. These were not mild expressions of regret, they were formal findings of institutional failure attached to named individuals. And then came the part that makes this story fully legible as a Victorian disaster. Nobody was charged with anything that stuck. The prosecutions that followed the inquest produced nothing. Phipps was charged with obtaining a licence by fraudulent misrepresentation. The charge was discontinued. There was no relevant statute under which such a prosecution could be sustained. The legal category for what Phipps had done argued to magistrates that a fall from a balcony was a sufficient escape route, and thereby obtained a licence for a building that did not meet the required standards, did not exist in English law in a form that courts could enforce through the criminal process. Sidney Herbert Bassing, the theatre operator and lessee who had run the building in this condition, was charged with breaching 3 specific licensing rules. The case was dismissed. The court determined that it had no jurisdiction. No one was convicted, no one was fined, no one was imprisoned. The coroner's jury had censured the magistrates. Shaw's report had named the architect. The evidence was clear, the chain of responsibility was documented, and the legal system looked at the whole assembled case and found that it had no instrument adequate to the task of holding anyone to account. This is not a footnote to the Exeter story. It is the Exeter story. 186 people died in a building that had been identified as unsafe before it opened, licensed without the required safety measures in place, and designed with 12 catalogue defects. And the law of England in 1887 had no mechanism to punish the people responsible. The knowledge existed, as Shaw's 1876 book attested. The warning existed, as the inspection requirements proved. The failure was documented, as the inquiry showed. And the consequence fell entirely, exclusively on the dead. Shaw's report did, however, make one practical recommendation that Exeter acted on almost immediately. The city, Shaw noted, had no dedicated city fire brigade. It had relied on a patchwork of insurance company brigades and voluntary responders. Shaw recommended the formation of a proper municipal fire service. Exeter City Fire Brigade was duly established, with William Pett of Sevenoaks appointed as its first chief officer. That brigade would serve the city until 1974, when it merged into Devon Fire Brigade, which itself became Devon and Somerset Fire and Rescue Service in 2007. The institution that protects Exeter today has its direct institutional ancestor in the aftermath of the fire of 1887. But the larger consequences of the Exeter disaster were not confined to Exeter. They could not be, after a parliamentary inquiry had formally established that a major British city had been licensing a brand new public building with known safety deficiencies, while no national enforcement mechanism existed to prevent it. The pressure for national reform was, after Exeter, irresistible in a way that it had not been after years of lobbying, after the continental disasters, after Shaw's own book, after the failed bill of 1885. The tightening of requirements for places of public entertainment that followed Shaw's report was systematic. The demands that now became embedded in licensing practice and, progressively, in law, were drawn directly from the catalogue of failures the Exeter fire had exposed. Exit doors on all escape routes were required to open outward and to be unlocked whenever an audience was present. Every tier of a public entertainment building was required to have at least two independent means of escape: the single staircase, the checkbox in the doorway. The absence of any alternative became the explicit counterexample against which all future construction was measured. Iron safety curtains, fireproof screens capable of being lowered to seal the stage from the auditorium, became a requirement in every comparable venue. Stage lighting and house lighting were required to run on independent supplies, so that an emergency shutdown of the stage gas could never again plunge an audience into darkness in the moment they needed to see the exits. Smoke outlets over the stage and auditorium became standard. Each of those requirements is a direct answer to a specific feature of the Theatre Royal, Exeter. The outward opening exit doors answer the bolted exterior door. The multiple independent escape routes answer the single gallery staircase. The iron safety curtain answers the absence of one in an 11-month-old building that had been required to have it. The independent lighting supplies answer the connected gas arrangement that plunged 300 people into darkness when the stage supply was cut. These were not general improvements, they were precise forensic responses to a documented chain of failure. The insurance industry moved in parallel. Because the Parliamentary Bill of 1885 still had not been passed, the formal statute governing these requirements would take further time to consolidate. The fire insurance companies used their commercial leverage to enforce compliance in the interim. A theatre that could not demonstrate it met the new standards paid substantially higher premiums or could not obtain cover at all. This was commercial regulation substituting for statutory regulation, as it had done before, but now with the weight of Exeter behind it. His Majesty's Theatre in Aberdeen was ordered by its own magistrates to carry out major structural changes within weeks of the Exeter fire. The reverberation was immediate and national. Henry Irving, the great actor-manager of the age who had contributed to the relief fund, was among the most prominent advocates for what became known in theatrical circles as the safety theatre model, a framework for new or rebuilt theatre construction that incorporated all the reformed requirements, designed from the beginning around the principle that the audience's safety was the primary architectural imperative. Irving's advocacy carried the weight of his name throughout the profession. The rebuilt Theatre Royal, Exeter, the building that replaced the ruin on Longbrook Street, was constructed to exactly those principles. Designed by Alfred Derbyshire and F. Bennett Smith, it incorporated a safety curtain, multiple exits, smoke outlets over the stage, and electric lighting throughout. Over 510 electric lamps were installed in the rebuilt house, eliminating the gas arrangements that had contributed to the darkness of the night of the 5th of September. The theatre reopened on the 7th of October 1889, just over 2 years after the fire, with the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company performing The Yeoman of the Guard. The generator that powered the new electric lighting during construction was housed temporarily in Robert Pople's stable yard. Pople's yard had received the dead in September 1887. 2 years later, it powered the lights of the rebuilt house. Robert Pople was elected mayor of Exeter 3 separate times in the years that followed the fire. Not once, 3 times. The city found in the man who had brought the ladders and opened his doors and made his yard available someone it wanted to honour publicly and repeatedly with the highest civic office it could offer. That is not a minor detail. It is Exeter's formal statement, expressed over years and multiple elections, about what he had done on that night. The reformed standards that Exeter drove into practice did not remain merely customary. They became, over time, codified. As late as 1934, the Home Office's guidance manual for theatre licensing specifically cited the Exeter Theatre Royal fire when setting out requirements for exit signage, dead ends in escape routes, and roof ventilation. Nearly 50 years after the disaster, the Home Office was still using Exeter as the reference case, the concrete demonstration of what happens when those specific requirements are absent. The fire had become part of the working vocabulary of British public safety regulation. Not a historical curiosity, but an active argument in active use by the people responsible for ensuring it never happened again. And then there is the safety curtain itself. Every safety curtain in every theatre in Britain today, the heavy fireproof screen that is lowered to the stage before and after performances, the one you may have noticed descending during a pre-show check without knowing quite what it was, exists as a legal requirement because of a regulatory cascade that has the Exeter Theatre Royal fire at its source. It is not a metaphor, it is not an indirect connection, the kind historians are sometimes too generous in drawing. The absence of a safety curtain from the Theatre Royal was a documented, specific condition of the licensing inspection. The inspection said it was needed. The theatre opened without one. 186 people died, in part because there was no barrier between a burning fly tower and the auditorium. The national requirement that every comparable venue must have one is the direct, traceable consequence of that specific absence. You pass through buildings that have safety curtains without thinking about what they are. That is how successful the reform has been, so embedded in standard construction practice that the device itself has become invisible through familiarity. It is worth knowing where it came from. The Theatre Royal, Exeter, had been required to have one before a single ticket was sold. It did not, and no one with the power to enforce that requirement did so. The broader pattern of reforms that Exeter set in motion is worth examining in one further dimension because it speaks to how safety culture actually changes in practice rather than in theory. The national statutory framework for theatre and public building safety was slow to cohere. The bills moved through Parliament with the friction that legislative change always encounters when commercial interests are affected. The licensing magistrates of each local jurisdiction retained significant discretionary power for years after 1887. What drove compliance in the interim was not primarily law, it was money. Fire insurance companies, responding to the clarity of Shaw's report and the scale of the Exeter liability, tightened their inspection regimes and restructured their premium schedules. A theatre without a safety curtain, without multiple exits, without independent lighting supplies, paid a premium that reflected the assessed risk, or could not get insurance at all. This was not idealism. It was actuarial calculation. The insurance industry had no interest in sentiment. It had an interest in not paying out on catastrophic losses. And the effect of that interest, translated into inspection requirements and premium structures, was to enforce the new standards more rapidly and more uniformly than the licensing magistrates alone would have done. This is a piece of Victorian regulatory history that tends to get overlooked in favour of the cleaner narrative of parliamentary reform. The truth is messier and, in some ways, more instructive. The standards that saved lives in British theatres after 1887 were enforced, in the first instance, by men with actuarial tables and commercial calculations, not by men with legislative intent. The law caught up, but the insurance companies were there first. Shaw's recommendation about the Exeter Fire Brigade was implemented. The building was rebuilt. The reformed standards spread outward from the inquiry's findings. Aberdeen moved within weeks. Other cities and their magistrates were watching. The Theatre Royal Fire had made the question of theatre safety impossible to treat as a local, discretionary matter. It had become a national one, and a political one, in a way it had never quite managed to be before. One figure who had been present at the edges of the story all along played a notable role in what came next. Henry Irving, the great actor-manager of the age, who had contributed to the relief fund, was among the most prominent advocates for what his contemporaries called the safety theatre philosophy. Irving's position was straightforward. The safety of the audience was not an optional amenity to be weighed against cost. It was the foundational obligation of anyone who asked the public to enter a building. His influence in theatrical circles and the example set by the stages he controlled helped to normalise the expectation that safety curtains, multiple exits, and non-combustible construction were not luxuries but requirements. The rebuilt Theatre Royal on Longbrook Street embodied that philosophy. Derbyshire and Bennett Smith designed it with the full catalogue of reforms incorporated from the beginning. It opened in October 1889. It stood for 73 years, surviving into an era of cinema and television that eroded the Victorian theatre circuit before being demolished in 1962. An office block occupies the footprint of both the original and rebuilt theatres today. Nothing of either building survives on the Longbrook Street site. No stone, no facade, no interior element. The address remains. The building does not. That office block is, in an architectural sense, the most complete erasure possible. The original theatre burned and demolished. The rebuilt theatre, the one constructed to the principles that Exeter's dead had purchased. Demolished for commercial redevelopment 62 years after its reopening. If you stood on the corner of Longbrook Street and New North Road today, you would see nothing of what was there on the evening of the 5th of September 1887. Except for one thing. Robert Pople's stable yard, the yard where the dead were first laid, and where the generator for the rebuilt theatre's electric lights was subsequently housed, stood behind the New London Inn. Whether the building of the New London Inn itself still stands under any form on Longbrook Street is a question that available records do not conclusively answer. The inn that Popple kept is no longer identified by that name. Popple himself is gone. His 3 terms as Mayor of Exeter are recorded. His tenure in that office was a sustained act of civic honour to what he had done as a private citizen with a collection of ladders on a Monday night in September. What does remain, and remains permanently, is in Higher Cemetery. The mass grave where the 118 unidentified dead were interred received a memorial that the sculptor Harry Hems carved from stone, a cross standing over the ground that holds those 15 shared coffins. Hems was an Exeter sculptor of considerable local reputation, and the cross he made for the Exeter Theatre dead is among the most sombre pieces of public memorial work to survive in the city. It is a working graveside monument, visited by people who know its history, and occasionally by those who stumble upon it, without knowing at first what they are looking at. Adjacent to the main memorial stands the headstone that Bombardier Scattergood's comrades in the Royal Horse Artillery erected in his name. It is a separate stone, not part of the mass grave, not one of the shared coffins, but a specific, named tribute from the men who had served beside Scattergood and who wanted it recorded that he had run into a burning building and not come out of it. The 2 memorials are twice the sculptured cross for the nameless and the headstone for the named soldier, stand in proximity in Higher Cemetery, and together they carry the weight of what happened on Longbrook Street. 1,000 to 2,000 people came to the cemetery on the first anniversary of the fire. There was no formal service. They came because there was nowhere else to go that was adequate to what had happened. The anniversary drew people not out of organised commemoration, but out of something more direct: the need to stand in a place that acknowledged the scale of what had been lost and what had been done wrong. The relief fund, which had collected £20,763 from Queen Victoria and the Lord Mayor of London and the goldfields of South Africa and ordinary people across the English-speaking world, distributed its resources across the years with careful attention to those who remained dependent on it. In 1931, 44 years after the fire, 5 people were still receiving payments from the fund, with £480 remaining. Those 5 people were elderly by 1931, survivors or dependents shaped by a disaster that had occurred before they were, or at the very edge of being, old enough to know what had happened. The fund had not been a gesture. It had been a sustained decades-long act of material support for people whose lives had been altered beyond repair on a Monday evening in 1887. 44 years. The reverberations of one night in a building that had been open for 11 months. The Illustrated Police News of the 10th of September, 1887, ran an illustration of the gallery staircase with a caption. It read, "The Exeter Theatre Calamity. A death trap, the gallery staircase." Not a comment on the fire, a comment on the staircase. The newspaper, 4 days after the disaster, had already understood what Harry Foot's testimony would confirm and what Shaw's report would formally establish. The fire was the ignition, but the staircase was the weapon. The staircase was what killed people, and the staircase had been there since opening night. A death trap, built to a licensed design, in a brand new theatre, with a certificate of safety that the magistrates had been asked for and had given despite knowing the required conditions had not been met. On the evening of the 5th of September, 1887, 300 people climbed a narrow staircase in the city of Exeter and took their seats in the gallery of a theatre that was less than 11 months old. They were working people, most of them. People who had saved for a Monday evening out, people who had brought their children, people who had no reason to doubt that the building they had entered was safe, because a panel of magistrates had looked at it, set conditions for its safety, and then licensed it despite those conditions not being met. The people in the stalls and the dress circle went home. The people in the gallery had one staircase, a box in the doorway, no alternative exit, no safety curtain, and no light. 186 of them did not come home. The stone cross at Higher Cemetery stands over ground that holds 118 people who could not be named after the fire had finished with them. 15 coffins, people who had bought cheap tickets on an opening night and climbed the only stairs available to them and never came down. Before every performance at every theatre in Britain, a heavy fireproof curtain is lowered to the stage. It is there because an inspection in 1886 said it should be there, and the magistrates of Exeter licensed a theatre without one, and 186 people died. That is all it took to change the rule permanently. One theatre, 11 months old, one night, 300 people went up the stairs.